In this video, I wanted to kind of have a discussion style video essay of sorts regarding a topic that I find immensely fascinating, and that is cave paintings. In particular, it's a kind of response to a book that I've been reading called The Mind in the Cave, and it's by a professor called David Lewis Williams. And in this book, Lewis Williams discusses the myriad of different theories as to the origins and meanings of why humans in the Upper Palaeolithic had a sudden explosion of art across specifically Western Europe in this video. I'm talking about specifically Western Europe here. In later videos, I would be intrigued to explore other places across the world because everywhere's fascinating. But I want to take a look into these theories, and especially the theory that Lewis Williams ultimately proposed, and see if it holds up to scrutiny. Overall, it's just a discussion. It's of course a topic that we'll never know or understand fully, which is why if I don't necessarily think or believe a theory is true, that doesn't mean it isn't, and I think that all theories have some level of merit to them. And in the end, I think that the study of prehistory is sort of like being a detective who's constantly chasing his suspect. So, to begin with then, what do we definitely know about cave paintings? Well, for a start, we could say that the oldest known cave paintings, in Europe at least, come from the El Castillo cave in modern day Spain. And carbon datings have estimated they are around 40,000 years old. This is of course the oldest known, not the first ever made in Europe. And it likely wasn't the first, for a few reasons that I'll return to later in this video. We can also say that they underwent a boom in numbers during warmer periods of the last glacial period. This likely did favour the artists, but this also doesn't tell much in regards to original purpose, just that warmer climate allowed for more time to actually create cave paintings. In terms of specific cave systems, they will be discussed as part of many case studies throughout this video. So let's get on to section 1. Section 1. Cave paintings as hunting magic. One of the earliest and most influential explanations came from Abbe Henri Brieux in the early 20th century. I've definitely not got that name right. I cannot pronounce French, anything French, to save the life of me, but I've absolutely got that wrong. Anyway, Brieux argued that cave paintings were a form of sympathetic magic. So by painting animals, especially prey animals, prehistoric hunters believed that they could control or influence them. The image was not art for display, but a tool meant to ensure a successful hunt, or multiple hunts. A classic example is from La Chaux Cave, where bulls, horses and deer dominate the walls. Some animals appear pierced with lines that resemble spears or arrows, which Brieux interpreted as ritual killing of the animal image before the hunt. This theory fit well with the early 20th century ideas about primitive religion and magic. However, problems soon emerged. And I think that this is where, we're going to get into the kind of negatives about each of these. I think all of them have something wrong with them, and it is very difficult to say for sure what happened. We will never know, and I think that's what's interesting about it. I'll keep saying this throughout. Genuinely, all of these interpretations are incredibly fascinating to me, apart from one, but we'll get to that when we get to it. So section 2, art for art's sake. I would say that this is the section in theory that I am least happy with, I most disagree with. I really don't think that art for art's sake as an interpretation of cave paintings is at all realistic. But let's go into it. Let's go into what art for art's sake is. It's kind of in the title. So sort of as the magical explanations and theories were declining, or maybe seem too out there, some scholars propose simpler ideas. Perhaps the cave paintings just existed because humans loved to paint. And this theory kind of treats cave paintings as an early aesthetic expression. I would say probably not, considering we have evidences from South Africa and on the African continent itself that we were expressing ourselves far earlier, and I really disagree with this completely. I think that we had at least some level of higher thought and higher cognitive development than these scholars, give us credit for, especially before we left Europe, left Africa rather. Sorry. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we already had the tools there, and we were already creating before we left. And perhaps then you could say that the warmer climates, the warmer spells in Europe did allow for boosting creativity, but I would say that maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all of a sudden art for art's sake just because there are paintings there. You wouldn't say that maybe in a million years' time that they find ruins of a skyscraper. Do you think the scholars then would say, oh, it's just building for building's sake? There's a reason to it. It's creative and artistic, but there's a reason to it, because we live in them, we do things in them, office buildings or whatever. I think it would be crazy to say the cave paintings were for art's sake. And going into my point from the last section was, why do it so underground? I guess we don't have evidence above ground of any art, so maybe there is a bias in the archaeological record just because so much does survive underground in these systems. But why go so far deep? These are really deep down. These people are going just to draw on walls. It's got to be a better reason. It's got to be a better reason than art for art's sake, I think. So let's move on to section 3 now. Section 3, structuralism and myth. In the mid-20th century, anthropologists began to approach cave art not as magic or decoration, but as symbolic systems. This was pioneered by a guy called Claude Levi-Strauss, and he argued that early societies organised the world and structured their world through binary oppositions: life and death, male and female, chaos and order, and that myths expressed these mental structures. So applied to cave art, this suggests animals were not literal creatures, but instead symbolic ones. Certain species may have represented conceptual opposites within a shared mythological framework. So these people had ideas. It was a cultural idea of what was opposite to what. So I think there was a theory that came out of structuralism that auroch represented females and stags represented male ideals, and that's why they were always either together or separate within cave systems. And, I think that's due to maybe mating displays from the stags with their antlers, or maybe with aurochs the largeness of them kind of maybe represented a form of a fertile ideal, maybe. And we know that they maybe idolized plumpness in a fertile in a fertility context, as we can see from the Venus figurines that were being made around this time. So, in some caves, herbivores and predators appear in distinct zones, possibly reflecting these divisions. As I say, aurochs and stags. This was identified as a pattern between the caves. I said the strength of this approach is that it takes prehistoric people seriously as symbolic thinkers. I do think there are weaknesses with it though. It's just again, like all the others, it's not easy to verify. You can't verify any of this stuff. It's purely speculation. It's like, running around like a headless chicken, just trying to find your head, put it back on. Because without any written myths, we can't say this for sure. But I think that there have been patterns identified, and I think this is a very serious contender. Not maybe as rigid of a structure. There might have been certain tribal or maybe specific regional, cultural identifiers, or what a certain group believed versus what another certain group believed. But I think there could definitely be made a case for this being, pretty close to the target, what we're trying to find out. On to the next section. So section 4, altered states and shamanism. Now this is the theory specifically proposed by David Lewis Williams. He does give credit to Levi Strauss and Leroy Goran for their pioneering work in structuralism, but this is the theory from David Lewis Williams, and this is obviously laid out in his book The Mind in the Cave. I highly suggest reading it. It's fascinating, even if you don't agree with maybe what he says. I don't know if I necessarily do, but I think that he really paints a vivid picture of the Upper Paleolithic, as a concept, as a worldview, the difference, how alien their worldviews must have been. It's very fascinating, and I will leave links in the description below for you to read it, because it's fantastic. So Lewis Williams, he proposed that many cave paintings are linked to altered states of consciousness experienced during trance, ritual, or sensory deprivation. His argument draws on neuroscience. When the human brain enters altered states through darkness, rhythmic sound, fasting, or stress, people often experience entopic phenomena, dots, zigzags, grids, and geometric shapes generated by the nervous system itself. These exact shapes, or something that look like these shapes, appear repeatedly in Upper Paleolithic caves, including El Castillo Cave, where red dots dated to over 40,000 years ago appear deep inside the cave. Lewis Williams suggested that people interpreted these internal visions culturally, transforming them into animals, spirits, or hybrid beings. In later stages of trance, individuals often report sensations of flight, transformation, or traveling through tunnels, experiences that mirror the imagery and locations of deep cave art. Importantly, this theory does not claim all cave art is shamanic, but that altered consciousness may explain why abstract symbols in deep caves matter. I think this is fascinating, personally. However, some critics do argue that while neurologically plausible, altered states are almost impossible to prove archaeologically. So this is where this kind of falls into the academic downfall of many theories, I think, and kind of not from any kind of pseudoscience aspect, but I think in terms of when looking at anthropology, a lot of stuff is difficult to prove. Paleoanthropology, anthropology, archaeology, they work very well hand in hand, but they also clash against each other quite a lot. So, but I think this is fascinating. I think the idea of a shared, wired brain, human conscious, subconscious visions that we all get, maybe when we close our eyes at night, maybe we've taken substances we're not supposed to, you get certain embedded, encoded visions of different things that may reflect your worldview, but they also may have reflected their worldview back in the day. So, and it would also make sense as, sensory deprivation, hallucinations, why they went so far down. But at the same time, if they were just completely out of it, just whacked out on mushrooms or hallucinating because of any sort of deprivation, then maybe they wouldn't have been able to draw such detailed and anatomically correct animals in them caves. You know, it does make a confusing think, you know, and I thought a lot about this, but I will let you know my thoughts entirely at the end. So to conclude this video, I would say that, in my own personal opinion, that once again, we can't know this. We cannot know any of these things. The only one I would say that is just not possible feasibly, I think, is the art for art's sake. I think it's not because it's boring or anything. I think it would be fascinating, the idea that humans, you know, had this need to draw, but I think that whatever evidence we do have just points us out of that direction, you know. And they may have seen some aesthetic beauty in what they were drawing, but I don't think that was the main purpose, personally. But if you do agree with that, if you do like the art for art's sake interpretation, please put it down below. We'll have a conversation about it. I would love to know what you think and why you think that, you know. It's a safe place for discussion here, I guess. I think that the answer lies probably somewhere between structuralism and altered states. Somewhere between. I can't quite put my finger on where I think it's at, you know. I don't completely agree with Lewis Williams, you know. I think there is a cultural tradition being passed on. I don't think it completely lies in the subconscious, you know, but I think certainly there's a clear structure, or there's something that they would identify with these animals in these caves, these symbols, you know, that reflect something about their world, whether it be binary oppositions like Levi Strauss said, or maybe it's something else that we just don't, we just won't know. But I think there are clear patterns to be seen, and I think in the end all of these theories kind of can work hand in hand to some aspect with each other to make something that would look somewhat like the truth, I think. But yeah, let me know what you think about all of these theories, which theory you prefer the most, and, you know, if you know any more, you know, that I haven't mentioned here today, because I know there's a few. So yeah, that's all from me in this video, and I will see you in the next one. See you later.